This lecture is from Chapter 9, and it is on the concept of prejudice versus the concept of discrimination. How do we define both of those, and what do they look like? First, a quote, "Prejudice locks the mind. Nothing can enter and nothing true can escape." So let's first define prejudice. It's an attitude, a combination of feelings, inclinations to act, and beliefs. As you can see on the left, it's a combination of the thoughts, the behaviors, and feelings, all of those things. A prejudiced person may feel dislike toward those different from themselves and behave toward them in a discriminatory manner, believing them ignorant and dangerous. So again, it's a combination of thoughts and feelings and behaviors toward other people. There's implicit prejudice, and then there's explicit prejudice. Implicit prejudice, which also could be called a bias. Thoughts and feelings are implicit if we are unaware of them or mistaken about their nature. We have a bias when, rather than being neutral, we have a preference for or aversion to a certain person or group of people. Thus, we use the term implicit bias to describe when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them, and I put in bold, without our conscious knowledge. So these are prejudices and biases we have that we're really not conscious of. So how is implicit prejudice measured if it's without our conscious knowledge? One way, which you'll read about in your textbook, is the IAT, or the Implicit Association Test. The IAT is a psychological tool designed to measure unconscious biases by assessing the speed at which individuals associate different concepts. The IAT helps reveal implicit biases that individuals may not consciously recognize, particularly regarding race, gender, age, disability, and other categories. So how does this work? We know what it measures now, but how does it work? IAT operates by presenting users with two sets of concepts, such as racial groups, black or white individuals, and adjectives, good or bad. Participants must quickly sort words or images into categories by pressing specific keys. The test measures response times to determine whether individuals unconsciously associate certain groups with positive or negative attributes more easily. Faster associations between a group and a certain trait suggest an implicit bias in that direction. An unconscious bias, in other words. It is worth noting that someone who is implicitly biased, according to the IT, will not necessarily behave in a discriminatory way. So just because you have this implicit bias or attitude doesn't necessarily mean that's going to become a behavior. And we'll discuss discrimination a little bit more in an upcoming slide. So we looked at implicit prejudice. What is explicit prejudice? In the case of explicit or conscious prejudice, the person is very clear about his or her feelings and attitudes, and related behaviors are conducted with intent. Conscious bias in its extreme is characterized by overt negative behavior that can be expressed through physical and verbal harassment or through more subtle means such as inclusion. And again, just like with implicit prejudice, it's important to note that someone with explicit prejudice may still not act on this prejudice. They may be conscious of thinking a certain way, but they still might not act on that. So let's look at discrimination now. Let's define that. Discrimination is the unfair or prejudicial treatment of people and groups based on characteristics such as race, gender, age, or sexual orientation. Simply put, prejudice is a negative attitude, as we defined at the beginning. Discrimination is negative behavior. So it's that portion of the idea that's actually behaving on that prejudice. And again, just because someone has a negative or prejudiced attitude doesn't mean they'll act on that behavior. So that's just important to remember. So now that we know what prejudice and discrimination are, how do we reduce those things? One way is to celebrate other cultures, I think, and learn about other cultures. When we see bigotry and hate speech, to call it out and teach children kindness and how to talk about differences and appreciate differences. Also, act in solidarity and intervene if safe to do so, and support human rights organizations. And those are just a few ways that we can fight prejudice and discrimination. And I'll end on another quote. Let's practice motivation and love, not discrimination and hate. And that's just a brief review of prejudice and discrimination, how they're defined and how they're different. If you have any questions, please let me know.